Hi, Terry here, and welcome to Times Gone Tech. Today's video doesn't really have anything to do with an actual Times Gone technology, but it does have to do with a past event, historic event, and in view of the date, I think it's kind of relevant for right now. Most of what I'm going to present is factual. We do know most of the facts. We do not know some of the facts, but there's enough facts pointing to certain speculations that we can assume that's pretty much probably how it happened, maybe. Something like that anyway. And then some of it is just filling in the gaps, because like with any historic event, there are some things going on in the background that we just don't know about. And even experts on subjects will often disagree as to the correct interpretation of parts of these events, even ones we know for a fact actually happened. So feel free to agree, disagree, however much you like. Historians refer to the 1920s in America as the Roaring Twenties. And whenever we hear that phrase, Roaring Twenties, we usually think of, flappers dancing to Charleston, smoking cigarettes, gangsters in dapper suits and LaSalle cars doing drive-by shootings with Tommy guns and bootleg liquor and all that good stuff, prohibition, all that. But for the most part, America wasn't really like that. In reality, the 1920s in America was actually known as the quietest, the most polite, the most crime-free period in American history, really. I mean, if you were set down at random, pretty much any place in America, you'd find it very quiet, very peaceful. You'd find the people there very polite, very nice. You wouldn't recognize it as being 1920s the way we think of it today. You might even find it quite boring. And let me just mention something here real quick about Prohibition, because this was the era of Prohibition. Prohibition being the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which mostly outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Now, not completely, but for the most part. It was not a complete and total failure as most people today believe it was. Before Prohibition, America was referred to as a nation of drunkards, and it was not an exaggeration. Car just drove by. We'll see how much of that this new camera or microphone of mine picks up. It's supposed to eliminate background noise. We're going to see. But as I was saying, it really wasn't the failure that everybody today seems to think it was. Before Prohibition, America was known as a nation of drunkards, and that was not an exaggeration. Alcoholism in America was a chronic, systemic, widespread social disease that was on the verge of tearing the country apart. I mean, it really was. And while Prohibition didn't eliminate alcoholism in America, it did significantly lower it. Even today, 95 years later, I think it is, the alcohol rate of consumption in America today is lower per capita than it was before Prohibition. People even today, nearly 100 years later, are drinking less now than they did before Prohibition. Most people did agree with Prohibition. They were not thumbing their nose at it. They actually voted for it. This wasn't just some fly-by-night law just shoved hurriedly through Congress. This was an amendment to the Constitution. That took years of concerted effort and approval state by state through the country to do. Most people supported it, at least at first. And most people obeyed it, and people did sober up. They stopped drinking. Most people did. And then after Prohibition ended, most of those people did not start drinking back again. I guess after being sober for 10 years, they decided they rather liked it. Anyway, Prohibition ultimately was a failure. That's why it was repealed. But it did leave a long-lasting positive influence on America. So in that respect, it may not have been a roaring success, but it wasn't a total failure either. But one place where it was a total failure was Chicago, Illinois. Now, in the 1920s, Chicago was ruled by gangs. almost constantly at war with each other for control of the lucrative bootleg business, along with prostitution, gambling, and larceny that was going on in the city. I mean, corruption was widespread. It ran from the mayor's office all the way down to the cop on the street. In fact, in just about 9 years, something like 800 gangsters were murdered in Chicago alone. By 1924, the two most powerful gangs in Chicago were the South Side Gang, ran by Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, and the North Side Gang, ran by Deanie O'Banion. These two gangs were bitter enemies even before Prohibition, but because of the money involved in bootlegging, they almost constantly open warfare between the two gangs. But Johnny Torrio, who was actually running the South Side Gang at that time, Capone was his young lieutenant, Torrio pretty much managed to keep a handle on things because of support from the mafia. Now, the south side of Chicago was pretty much ran by Italians, and the north side, Germans, Polish, Irish immigrants. But the south side was the biggest gang, and it was ran by the Italians, and they had the support of the Italian mafia. Now, the problem here was O'Banion was a racist and proud of it. He hated the Italians in Chicago and just really enjoyed bad-mouthing them, insulting them, bullying them around just as much as he could any chance he got. In fact, he even had a habit of stealing shipments of beer and selling it back to the Italian gangs, laughing at them while doing it. On November 10, 1924, O'Banion was killed at his flower shop by 3 men, including 2 Jenna family gunmen, John Scalisi and Albert Anselmi, over a debt owed him by Angelo Jenna. Now, O'Banion had called Angelo on the phone and very abusively demanded Alberto pay the money back. So, naturally, 2 of Alberto's men paid Deanie a little visit. One of the men held his hand out to O'Banion, and Scalisi and Anselmi shot him. In 1925, Jaime Weiss took over control of the North Side Gang. And he believed that Capone was responsible for O'Banion's murder. Now, Capone wasn't. He really had nothing to do with it. This was a private matter over a bet and, owing money between these 2 men. But Weiss convinced himself that Capone was behind it. But for some reason, instead of going after Capone, he went after the South Side Gang's actual leader at that time, Johnny Torrio. He ambushed Torrio, and Torrio was shot several times and seriously injured and almost died. But he didn't. He recovered. And then he decided it was just time to get out of the rackets. He'd probably pushed his luck far enough, he decided. So he turned total control of the South Side Gang over to Capone, and then he went back to Italy. Now, in 1926, Capone was living on the 2nd floor of the Hawthorne Hotel, and he was down in the dining area when a series of cars started driving by filled with men with machine guns, started just blasting away into the hotel. Well, one of the cars finally stopped, and a man named Pete Gusenberg got out. Now get this, wearing a khaki army shirt, overalls, and carrying a Thompson .45 caliber submachine gun. He got down on one knee and proceeded to empty an entire 100-round magazine into the hotel. Then he calmly got up, walked back to his car, and just nonchalantly drove away. I don't know about you, but I find it hard picturing a high-level 1920s gangster triggerman in a khaki shirt and overalls. Well, anyway, surprisingly, nobody was killed or even seriously injured. One woman sitting in a car outside did get some flying glass in her eye, and Capone paid for all of her medical bills. It came to about $10,000. Now, keeping that in perspective, today that's close to $200,000. And Capone just wrote the check and handed it over. And he paid for the restoration of the hotel too. I mean, it's little wonder that the public was seeing him as this Robin Hood, and his gang of merry men thumbing their nose at the man. It made him actually quite popular. But the event really scared Capone, and it really pissed him off. So he put out a hit with the mafia's consent against Weiss. Now, Capone's triggermen were professional Italian assassins. They were a little more successful than Weiss was, and their plan was a little more carefully thought out. They managed to kill Weiss and actually did it right in front of the same flower shop where Deanie O'Banion was killed. So after that, Bugs Moran, George Bugs Moran, I love that name, he stepped up as the leader of the North Side Gang. Now, there was actually another guy named Duffy. The two were supposed to run the gang together, but Duffy immediately got killed on his own, but it had nothing to do with the gang war. It was some altercation he had with police. He got into a fight with some police and they shot him. So that left Bugs Moran in charge of the North Side Gang. So here's the situation. In just 8 years, Capone had risen from being a bar bouncer to undisputed ruler of the most powerful gang in Chicago. Now, Capone had the support of the Chicago Mafia, but he couldn't run the Mafia himself because he wasn't Sicilian. So he had a friend of his who was Sicilian and was a member of what they called the inner circle, the union it was known as, or the brotherhood. Capone managed to maneuver him, Tony Lombardo, into the position of leading the Mafia in Chicago. And since they were friends, that pretty much gave Capone carte blanche to do just whatever he wanted. But one of those Italians, one Giuseppe Aiello, really didn't care much for either Capone or Lombardo. He was also Sicilian and was also a member of the inner circle. And it turns out he was extremely jealous of Capone's success. He wanted control of the gang for himself, and he wanted the control of the Mafia for himself. Pretty ambitious guy. In fact, he'd actually tried to kill Capone on his own several times. He even put out a contract on Capone, a bounty of what today would amount to almost $500,000, over $300,000, which is something that 1967 movie made by Roger Corman got completely wrong. Aiello was referred to as a five and dime punk that Capone didn't even know he was alive. Well, the guy tried to kill him several times, so obviously Capone knew he was alive. And the guy could put out a contract on Capone worth almost $500,000. So he wasn't some five and dime punk either. He was a member of the inner circle of the Italian Mafia in Chicago. This guy had money, power, and connections. And Capone was well aware of that. And as to that contract, on at least 4 occasions, people did try to collect it. And they were all killed by one Machine Gun Jack McGurn, an ex-boxer who had been with the North Side Gang for a short time before joining up with Capone. McGurn had excellent hand-eye coordination and was a deadly accurate marksman, and he quickly became Capone's top trigger man. Now, here's the situation on this. Capone clearly knew Aiello was trying to snuff him out, but this guy was a member of the inner circle, so Capone, who wasn't, he couldn't just kill the guy. He had to have sanction from the Mafia, and they weren't going to give it to him. Now, for Bugs Moran's part, he'd learned from Weiss and O'Banion that you couldn't just kill Al Capone. There were repercussions for even just trying. And for Aiello's part, every assassin he'd sent after Capone had gotten iced, so he knew a front attack on Capone wasn't possible. He had to get rid of Tony Lombardo, but he couldn't just kill Lombardo. These guys are members of a union. They didn't just go around killing each other, okay? So he needed the Mafia sanction also, and they weren't likely to give it to him. Again, they didn't want they didn't want members of this union killing each other just over a few bucks. So they were really a tight group. They were a well-knit group of people. So Aiello went to Moran and made a deal with him. He would set Lombardo up for a hit if Moran's boys would then take him out. So the North Side Gang would take the heat for the assassination, in other words, and then Aiello would get himself elected as his successor. Now that would put Aiello in charge of the Chicago Mafia. So Capone would then lose his Mafia support, and Moran could go after him without repercussions from the Mafia. Moran accepted, and the plan almost worked. The setup worked, and Lombardo was killed, but Aiello moved too slow to get himself elected as his replacement, and Capone reacted a lot quicker, and he actually got another friend of his, one Patsy Lollardo, elected in his stead. So Capone managed to keep his mafia connections, though that part of the plan was a total failure. So Aiello went back to Moran with a new plan to kill Lollardo. You gotta love this guy's persistence, for lack of a better word. Okay, now, with this new plan, Aiello, who had not been connected with the hit on Lombardo, see, he just set it up, and nobody knew about that. He would get two of Moran's gunmen into Lollardo's home, they would kill him, and then Aiello would move a little quicker this time. Moran said, yeah, okay. Now this time the plan worked, actually, and it was actually Moran and Frank Gusenberg, Pete Gusenberg's brother, who actually got into the Lollardo's home and shot him. And then Aiello managed to get himself elected as the head of the mafia in Chicago. But before he could manage to celebrate, two unidentified gunmen with Chicago typewriters took him out. Now, I wonder who they could have been and who could have sent them. So, by scheming with Aiello, all Moran actually managed to accomplish was really pissing Capone off at him and getting 3 men killed for nothing. And that's when Capone decided he'd had enough, and he ordered a hit on Moran. And he gave the job to his top young triggerman, Jack McGurn. Now, Pete and Frank Gusenberg, Moran's two top triggermen, had already tried killing McGurn several times. So McGurn had a score to settle with those two anyway. And he saw this as a great opportunity to take out 3 flies with 1 swat, so to speak. McGurn devised a plan that was actually pretty sneaky. Now, he knew he couldn't get close enough to Moran to do a direct attack, so he carefully laid out a plan to lure Moran into a trap. First, he knew Moran's gang worked primarily out of a garage called the SMC Cartage Company in what is now Lincoln Park. They had been in O'Banion's flower shop, but they moved out because of the bad publicity on those 2 hits. So he paid 2 contract killers from New York, posing as musicians, to rent a room across the street in this charming boarding house and watch the gang's comings and goings. Now, Lincoln Park today is a pretty swanky neighborhood. But back then it was a lot more dodgy. This was actually the headquarters for the Moran gang's bootleg distribution operation. And the chatter of the Chicago typewriter was not unheard of in that neighborhood back then. Also, it just so happens that Moran was living in a high-end hotel only a couple blocks away. Now this is important, to get back to that. After getting his lookouts in place, McGurn then brought in a member of the mafia to get a hold of a stolen police car, 2 police uniforms, and rent a garage a couple of blocks away from the cartage company and sit there and wait. He then got a low-ranking member of Capone's own gang, a guy in the movies called Nick Sorello. I don't know what his real name probably was. But anyway, McGurn paid this guy to hijack a truck of old log cabin whiskey from a gang operating out of Detroit known as the Purple Gang. Now, the Purple Gang smuggled whiskey across the border from Canada and distributed it throughout the Great Lakes area. And they were delivering a load to Capone. So basically, McGurn paid a member of Capone's gang to steal his own whiskey from him. Then Sorello called Moran and offered to sell it to him. Now, that wasn't really unheard of back then. I mean, these gangs were constantly stealing from and selling back to each other all the time. So that wouldn't have raised any suspicion on Moran's part. So Moran agreed to buy it. And at the same time, Capone decided to leave town so nobody could connect him with any of these goings on. And he went down to his house in Florida. Now, when Sorello delivered the whiskey, Moran's boys pushed him around a little bit, and they stole some of the sale price back for themselves.
You don't pay the dingbat, we don't pay you. That's fair.
Now, a few days later, Sorello called Moran again, offering to sell him another truckload, same price. But because of how Moran's men had treated him the last time, he said he would only do business directly with Moran. Moran agreed and told him to show up at the cartage company at 10:30 the next morning, which just happened to be February 14th. And this is why where Moran's living in that hotel nearby is important, because it wasn't any out of his way, really, to stroll over to the cartage company, take care of Sorello, talk to the boys, see what's going on. But if Moran lived across town, because this is February, it's the middle of winter in Chicago, he might have just decided to stay home and let his second in command take over, and McGurn's plan wouldn't have worked. McGurn had also brought in the same two mafia hitmen, Scalisi and Anselmi, who had taken out O'Banion and Weiss. And he had them wait in the garage with a truck, wait on a signal from the two lookouts in the boarding house across the street. So now, with the trap set, all McGurn had to do was wait.